Out of all the novels that Stephen King has written in his industrious and storied career, Salem's Lot is the book he claims as his favorite, partially inspired, according to the author, by a dream. The dream was this: King entered into a dingy, abandoned home and saw a body swinging from the rafters, its eyes picked out by crows, its flesh rotting, and as it turned, it was revealed to be King's own face. If this story is true, I suppose it sort of lends a certain gravitas to King's destiny as being a horror author, very much like Luke Skywalker encountering his own visage behind the mask of Darth Vader in the cave, right? It's a little bit self-serving. Sort of like the characterization of Ben Mears in his novel, Salem's Lot. We will be talking about the book a little bit today, as well as Toby Hooper's 1979 miniseries adaptation. Guys, I'm George. Thanks for coming back to my film journal today. Always good to see you again. Let's get started. The 1979 Salem's Lot TV miniseries stars David Soul as Ben Mears, the writer, a novelist who returns to his small hometown, a town in Maine. He's driven to write a novel based on his experience with a hanged man.
I think I saw Hubie Marston hanging by his neck. His face green, his eyes puffed shut. His hands livid. It was ghastly.
A cursed man who died swinging from the rafters of his notorious house, the Marston House, a cursed establishment that looms over the small rural township of Jerusalem's Lot. Empty, ominous, and for many years, a flashpoint for conspiracy and rumor for the simple townsfolk, but ultimately out of mind. That is, until two strange men move in and revive the speculation and the terror that has haunted the imagination and the conscience of this small village throughout its history. Fondly remembered as one half of the primetime cop duo Starsky and Hutch, as well as for his sappy #1 hit single, Don't Give Up on Us Baby, Soul was somewhat of a sex symbol and a hot item in the mid to late 70s, though his haircut, the floppy dog ears look, is maybe one of the most unfortunate to ever come out of the 70s, but a look, nonetheless, which achieved somewhat mainstream success, even among the non-balding community. I like Soul in the part, though. He's easy to watch during the more breezy early scenes, endearing himself to the townsfolk and to Susan, the local schoolteacher. But I was pleasantly surprised to find he's even more effective as the stakes get higher throughout the movie. I found Ben to be a more believable and relatable character in the film because he's played by the handsome and confident David Soul, whereas while reading the book, I couldn't shake the vision of a slightly more handsome version of a young Stephen King in the part. Mears as the popular good guy who gets the prettiest girl in town to fall for him. His poetic charm and intellect seemed a bit too much like an obvious, aspirational caricature of King himself. And there's another King stand-in character in this story, the young Mark Petrie, played in the film by Lance Kerwin, a very fine young actor with sunny California looks. He could have probably fit the casting bill for Luke Skywalker if he were a few years older, and I'll bet he tried for the part. Mark is a star student, yet misunderstood for his love of horror films and monster magazines. His bedroom a shrine to the horror greats that would fit in well at Forrest J. Ackerman's house. Of course, Mark's devotion to what I'm sure his parents and teachers would characterize as odd or as a waste of time is exactly what provides him with the foresight to recognize the very real plague of vampirism that will haunt the tiny town. The scene in which Mark resists the temptation of his now undead friend is very powerful, and Kerwin sells it well. You can see the pain in his face.
Go away. Go away!
Unlike the late 19th century tales of Dracula, the victims in Salem's Lot are not Victorian dandies. They're people just like you or me. Middle-class, small-town people, even children. Children whose deaths are felt and families are torn apart by the loss. The vampire threat in Salem's Lot is not campy. It's not spooky. These are horrible, lecherous freaks. Cruel, disinterested, selfish. And the evil in Salem's Lot emanates from two men. The more visible of the two, Richard Straker, was played by the esteemed James Mason. TV miniseries were very big at the time. Ensemble casts with big movie stars from old Hollywood was a big part of the draw, and Mason is great in the part. An aloof, elderly gentleman playing in stark contrast with the majority of the men in the movie, generally rugged handymen, all of whom, from the chief of police to the town's biggest realtor, he treats as beneath him, as fools. They are mild impediments to his mission or bumbling obvious tools in his devious scheme. The arrogant aristocrat, hampered by plebs like he was by the brash Kirk Douglas in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or Cary Grant in North by Northwest. He has a sort of elegant disdain for the people in Salem's Lot, suffering them to touch his collection of priceless relics in the antique shop he has set up as a front for his and his partner's villainy. And Stryker's mysterious and unseen partner in the antiques business, Kurt Barlow, always mysteriously away on a purchasing trip.
Mr. Barlow arrived yet?
Mr. Barlow is in New York.
Coming soon?
Hard to tell. He may go to Europe on a buying trip.
Is in reality an undead creature of the night, festering away in a coffin in the bowels of the Marston house. In the novel, it's made more evident that the townsfolk suspect the two ostensible businessmen of being homosexuals, only hinted at in the movie. The YouTube channel In Praise of Shadows and the video on King's Vampires makes the great observation that the homosexual subtext mirrors the sexual anxiety of Stoker's original Dracula novel, in which a foreign Eastern European count arrives in London to seduce Western European Anglo women. Here, in Salem's Lot, the coded homosexual pair, the vampire and his familiar, first strike at two young boys. Now, of course, Stryker and Barlow aren't really gay. One is an undead creature of the night, the other his maniacal servant, so I think King is making a comment more on the parochialism of the rural townsfolk when they make aside comments about their sexual proclivities, rather than any indictment of the homosexual community itself. But the sexual anxiety and otherness surrounding them is worth pointing out, and an evolution of something that was very prominent in Bram Stoker's novel, here updated for the 1970s. The schema of the vampire in King's conception is less the traditional vampire, one who preys on others for immediate gratification, but instead one more demonic, more a corrupting force of evil in league with capital E evil itself. The town begins to change. One by one, vampires are created from the townsfolk, and on they multiply. More body snatcher than the traditional Count Dracula we're used to seeing. And body snatcher movies are interesting, and they tend to stand up well to allegory, whether they be Don Siegel's Cold War-era body snatchers, though it's still debatable whether the victims assimilated in that film are supposed to be communists or rabid anti-communists of the Joseph McCarthy variety. The jury is out. Still, we know there's something going on there. But of what relevance or thematic value is the body snatcher in the mid to late 1970s? King made some hand-fisted analogy to Watergate, how the entire political class of D.C. was body snatched, if you will, by the corrupting power of Nixon. Boy, do I get tired of hearing about f***ing Watergate from these boomers. Did anything else ever happen in the 1970s? In my review of Charlie Varick, I wrote about that film's connection to the recessionary economic pressures of the mid to late 70s and their effect on small towns and working class people. And at the risk of repeating myself, I think you can draw a similar inference here, that the vampirism draining the town of its essence and leaving it a husk of itself could resonate with audiences of the time, and now, for that matter. That's possible, but it could also be an analogy for King's place in his own town of Bangor, Maine. As someone who was now a successful millionaire author, could King have felt out of place in his hometown? Similar to Edgar Wright's sentiments regarding his film The World's End, in which a group of friends reunite in their small hometown, only to find that the once reliable, smiling faces of neighbors and authority figures have been replaced by drones. Robots with blue blood, to be exact. Wright spoke of the film as a eulogy for a lost adolescence, the inability to recapture the feeling of community from one's youth, that when you return home, somehow everything has changed.
It's not us that's changed, it's the town!
Along with the obviously suspicious Stryker, Ben Mears is an object of suspicion as well, with some of the local yokels. Clearly, King was trying to make an inference here that only a prejudicial, bumbling fool would be adversarial towards Mears, a well-traveled and well-respected and educated hero. One of the few who stand a chance of defeating the evil when the simple townsfolk cannot. King has spoken at length about the inspiration for the book, and one of the primary inspirations began with his pontificating about the idea of Dracula in modern-day New York. His wife commented that Dracula would probably be hit by a taxicab, and King agreed, believing Dracula couldn't be effective in a city. Perhaps, though, he could terrorize a small town. And look, not that I think the small-town vampire story is a bad idea, but it seems completely plausible, if not more so, that this type of body-snatching vampire plague would catch on in a big city. How could it not? A place where people are more anonymous, cramped so tightly together in apartment complexes and buildings. This must have evaded King because the line about the taxicab seems to imply something. That big city folk are sophisticated, that the hustle and bustle would overpower a Dracula-type creature. I don't believe that. I would think that a close-knit small town of rural citizens who probably have readier access to weapons and a lower threshold for tolerance of difference would be the last place someone like Kurt Barlow would want to go. And in my estimation, the big city, I guess, seems to breed apathy sometimes. In my attempt to psychologize Stephen King and his attitude towards rural America, I was reminded of the Arthur Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes story, The Copper Beeches, where Holmes thwarts a scheme involving an innocent governess who moves to the country. In conclusion, Holmes explains to Watson that, "It is my belief, Watson, founded upon my experience, that the lowest and vilest alleys of London do not present a more dreadful record of sin than does the smiling and beautiful countryside, and that the pressure of public opinion can do in the town what the law cannot accomplish. Look at these lonely houses, each in its own fields, filled, for the most part, with the poor ignorant folk who know little of the law. Think of the deeds of hellish cruelty, the hidden wickedness which may go on year in, year out in such places, and none the wiser." I think this concluding hypothesis by Holmes accurately represents King's view of rural communities as well. Think how often we see isolation in the country breeding evil in King's work. The Shining, Misery, Cycle of the Werewolf, to name a few. If anything, the citizens of Salem's Lot fall to the vampire plague simply out of a lack of belief. Belief that the supernatural can exist. Belief that they have the power to defeat it. They have a lack of faith, which separates the victims from the survivors, the people who have lost their way. They commit infidelities, in the case of Larry Crockett, the town realtor, who also sells out the town for money, looking the other way while he carries out sordid and suspicious errands for Straker. They're sadistic in certain cases, or selfish and fearful in the case of Chief Gillespie.
You're crazy. There aren't any such things as
Well, then what do you
vampires.
say is happening here? Something's happening here.
I don't know. Some kind of crazy.
You're scared.
Whatever it is, I'm not saying.
You're a constable here.
Was.
Running.
Running. And you're staying?
In the novel, the character of Father Callahan is a much more important piece, an alcoholic priest who rises to the occasion and wakes from his malaise in the wake of a supernatural threat. In the novel, he has this great moment where he speaks of the reinvigorated Catholic Church. Here, unfortunately, in the TV movie, he's reduced to a mere cameo appearance, an unfortunate piece of narrative to excise considering the 3-hour canvas of the miniseries format. Without the inclusion of the spiritual battle of Father Callahan, the film loses some of its thematic heft, as I read Callahan's reawakening and call to adventure, for lack of a better phrase, as an allegory for the loss of identity, spiritual, ancestral, etc., which leads communities into disarray, into lethargy, into the kind of state which would allow your world to be hollowed out from the inside by evil. Toby Hooper was hired to direct the miniseries based on the strength of his incredible film, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a film that is so good, so indelible, so brutal in its documentary-style realism, it's been hung as an albatross around the poor guy ever since. And by that I mean it's submitted into evidence by a very vocal group of Toby haters as Exhibit A in the divisive argument over who actually directed Toby's most successful movie, Poltergeist, himself or his producer. They say that Poltergeist feels more like a Steven Spielberg film, nothing at all like Texas Chainsaw, which is a film driven by its sheer brutality, its gory, visceral impact, rather than the haunted house staging and showy effects roller coaster we see in Poltergeist. I think Salem's Lot and Hooper's film The Funhouse, to a certain extent, are great transitional films in Toby's favor and a testament to his versatility. I think, after all, we have to wrangle with the idea that Texas Chainsaw Massacre was made in an attempt by Hooper to make the most commercial film he possibly could. In that way, he was sort of a man for hire in the open market. And when the job of directing a TV miniseries came down, he knew exactly what he had to do and how it had to play. And I think Hooper does a nice job here in doing what he was hired to do, which is to inject creepiness and a sense of doom into a film shot within the limits of a television budget and schedule. In my review of John Carpenter's The Fog, I discussed Carpenter's conception of that movie. He wanted it to be PG. He wanted to prove he could make an ominous, eerie film without overt violence. And in certain scenes, I think he prevails, but according to the director himself, he failed. And he had to go back and shoot a few scenes of gruesome violence to up the ante on thrills in that movie. Salem's Lot is the same challenge for Hooper, and he succeeds. Of course, Salem's Lot is probably a little more hardcore than regular 70s TV fare, which I think lends to its enduring success, and its accessibility on television meant it became a lot of young viewers' first experience with the horror genre. But nevertheless, moments like these are genuinely creepy. The glass, the thumping drone of the music, running the shots in reverse. This is frightening stuff, and the reveal of the scary Kurt Barlow, more Nosferatu here, than the ancient gentleman of the book, is effective, and I believe the film needed something drastic and striking from a visual perspective, and I don't think it disappoints. I mean, the impact of the decrepit Marston house, the ash falling from the sky, the antlers and bones borrowed from the set of Texas Chainsaw stand in such relief to the modern setting of the first half of the film. It's a reminder of ancient evil, that it exists. While we're all toiling in the outside world, getting new haircuts, wearing the latest style of bell-bottom jean, working our menial gigs, watching TV, and drinking beer, ancient evil sits, persists, waits, and maybe we will be unfortunate enough, or maybe strong enough, to venture into its unchanging, rotting edifice. This is why Toby got the job. For show-stopping moments like this, for the grizzled face of David's soul in the scenes which bookend the film, where we see Mears living totally off the grid, out of time, like the Marston house and Barlow, fighting a never-ending ancient war that has taken him and Mark to Mexico and away from their comfy lives in Salem's Lot. While I enjoy Salem's Lot, the miniseries, quite a bit, I had to say I was a little let down by the book. It was not one of my favorites. It felt more to me like a testing ground for ideas in the horror genre that King would improve in his much better third novel, The Stand. I think it's just a terrific book, one where King really comes into his own in terms of like inventing this almost like ontology of evil, epitomized by Randall Flagg, the scary, wandering, nomadic character that's able to attract and hypnotically draw those predisposed to evil towards him so he can bank up his legions in Las Vegas to defeat the good people in Colorado. It's a great sort of end-of-the-world, apocalyptic showdown of truth and virtue versus like evil and terror and vice. And I love it. I love The Stand. It's a terrific book. Salem's Lot, enjoyable read. I felt that it picked up more as the book went on and kind of had a lot more impact and effect. I spoke about Father Callahan. He also has like a terrific moment where he stands up to Kurt Barlow, and the way King describes how like the forces of like the power of God flow through his arm to his cross as he faces this ultimate evil. And the way that Ben Mears also channels this power towards the end when he's breaking into the basement to defeat Barlow were really terrific. It's a lot more grim. It's more grim than the movie, but I felt like a lot of the opening, the beginning, first and second acts was just a little much. I think that some of the things that Hooper excised for the television series were warranted. But yeah, it's a great series. I hope maybe I had some interesting insights here for you guys. If you like my work, feel free to support me on Patreon, follow me on X or Letterboxd to see what I'm watching. Always appreciate likes and subscriptions. It really helps the channel grow. So thanks very much, and I'll see you next time.